Trump Redux. Okay, so let's attempt an interpretation of Trump as a primacist. Pope Leo the 13th has said in his Libertas 1888, man indeed is free to obey his reason, to see moral good, and to strive unswervingly after his last end. Undoubtedly, we can come to we can deliberate and then make a decision after deliberating rather than merely casting a vote. This is one of the points that I disagree with the form of analysis now everywhere in power and university, which says that judges vote just based on the fact that in the Supreme Court you see the judges numerically decide on Supreme Court cases. There's a majority, there's a minority in most cases, but then the funny thing is the minority gets to write something and say this is why we objected to what the majority did, and the point being they deliberated on a reasoned decision, and then they say this is what reason tells us, this is what seems self-evident to us after thinking through what we know. You can always say there's bounded rationality, and maybe they do differently if either the facts changed or what they knew changed, of course. But the point is, yes, man can act on his reason. Now, the second part of the Pope's statement, whether we can act on our final ends, is somewhat more murky due to the fact that we don't know what the questions are that our reason unfailingly can answer and what the ones they aren't. Why am I going through all this? Let me look at some of the alternatives to that, which are also points of reason. So I'm not particularly arguing that Trump is acting on deliberation. Everyone says that he mostly doesn't. Whether he does or doesn't is in question. We can look at what he does de facto. We can look at what the question of whether he acts on principle. They can also say in a Kantian fashion that whoever doesn't act on principle, nonetheless, you can say this is what is tacitly, this is what his maxim is. Tacitly, this is the principle he's acting on, even if he doesn't raise his own eyes to it. Goethe said, "He who acts is always without conscience." So that sort of seems like it's something that fits Trump better. He who acts is always without conscience. So if you're simply acting, then every action is one by which we choose one of the possibilities which is available to us, and therefore not others, and therefore we come into some kind of conflicts. So let's look at this whole situation through. There's an article, I'll put it on the video below from the probably it's a Primacist organization itself, so that might be important, but the European branch of the Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin produced a taxonomy of Republican strategists, by which they said their scheme is there's three forms of Republicans. They came out in 2022, restrainers, prioritizers, and primacists. So I want to argue this, basically my thesis is, yes, the neocons peeled away from Trump and joined up with Harris, and the Dems, saying we need adult supervision or something like that, especially on foreign policy. Of course, they were less concerned, I believe, with abortion, gun rights. They may be even against gun rights. I'm not sure. It doesn't matter, but they were less concerned with the supposedly domestic policy issues, to which could be added the gender issues. They mentioned the wokeism, actually. But after the neocons peeled away, this other group, the Primacists, came in. So they don't list neocons here. They themselves, I think, Council of Foreign Relations, are kind of... yeah, that's hard. I don't know if there should be classed as primary neocons or primary Primacists, which is what they're calling themselves. So maybe Primacists could be regarded as a rebranding of a new kind of neocon. But they say, again, restrainers, prioritizers, Primacists, restrainers. So interesting. The most impressive restrainer is Bannon, Steve Bannon, but they also mentioned Rand Paul. The most important prioritizer seems to be Vance. So restrainers are people who are saying stop funding stuff going on in Ukraine, Europe, Afghanistan, etc. Whereas the prioritizers are saying, well, it's not that we're necessarily in principle against NATO or Ukraine or something like Fukuyama spreading the American form of government around the world. We're not necessarily against that, but we have to prioritize and spend money on, because there's so many problems in America itself. I think the distinction between the distinction between domestic and foreign is obvious, but at the same time it doesn't exist, in the sense that whatever America does as a domestic policy radiates around the global system, so-called. So this is a question, and this is one of the main questions I want to bring in. And so then what I'm saying is the Primacists came in and elected Trump. So that's my first thesis, is even though Trump lost support from some forms of Republicans, he gained support from others, and the Primacists are basically, in my view, the ones that had the most control over government policy. So, for example, there was under Obama, we got the defense posture statement, which first started using the language of the global rivalry of that's not the exact way they say that, but that China and Russia are the especially China is the global rival, and there's how do they call that? The great powers rivalry, I think is the phrase. And then the Primacist answer to these statements, which were, we should understand it this way. There's sort of like, there used to be something called, I think it was like quadrannual statements that came out from, which would make the political figures which would make the executive on the same page as all the military. I forget how those statements are called, but there's statements that would give every acting military leader a script which would be the same as what the politicians were saying. was mentioned sometime by Hillary Clinton. And so then we could see when they come out with this kind of language like great power rivalry, then the think tank type people, Council on Foreign Relations and so on, look at that and then they criticize it, and then they came out with the view that they'd start paying in personam, if that's the phrase, visits to senators and representatives, and saying great power rivalry is not, as these statements say, a goal. It can't be a goal. Winning is a goal. So that's the Primacist position in its simplest form. And so then why would I say, and many of them agreed with that immediately, because it makes sense. It makes simple sense. They can't just having a rivals thing going on and on forever doesn't make sense. Winning seems to make sense, or at least it's that you have an end goal. Everybody keeps saying, "What's your end game? What's your telos?" So they give them a telos, and it's clear. And a lot of people like to have a clear telos, and then they can. So, unfortunately, Bannon is. I'm not saying unfortunately from my own point of view, but I'm just saying from the point of view of this statement. Bannon likes to quote Sherman to say, "A simple plan aggressively executed." So, but Bannon's actually against this Primacist view, but the Primacist, his enemies, have given a simple plan and say this is how you aggressively execute it. And so then, is Trump a Primacist? So one thing I want to bring in is, let's try to link this to fundamental ontology through Wallerstein and global systems theory, which I believe has come into the neocons through Kissinger primarily, because Kissinger was a big world system analyst guy, and having been already a Spangler guy, and having had Nixon read Spangler. There's an episode of Firing Line with Bill Buckley that's interesting, with Kissinger talking about Spangler and correcting Buckley on his claim that Spangler was a guy that had Schadenfreude or whatever. It's not that Spangler is depressed, but it's rather that Spangler says there's this structure in things, and it's like on a biological metaphor, and cultures grow and then they wither and die at a certain point, just as a tree does, or any living thing. It's sort of like in those days, in Spangler's time, people were more in Prussia. So prior to World War I, there was some place called Prussia, where Weaver has said, the guy that says, I noticed Bannon has probably read this book recently, this Weaver book on Ideas Have Consequences. Dugan has been promulgating that as the American version of his thinking about the trajectory of the West and of Europe, I suppose, as a whole. I mean, Russia is part of Europe. But what I was saying about Spangler is that at the time, biology was split between the old organicist view, was like the heart pumps blood, it has a telos, it's an organ. Yeah, it's like a machine with a meaning. So remember, Aristotle has a body of work called the Organon. And the mechanist view, which is like the people are talking all the time about the stupid question that they never, it's stupid just because they never clarified to themselves or anyone else what the horizon in which the question is being asked, what the options are. So they're saying, is the world deterministic? But they never say what on earth are you talking about? So if we have a mechanistic view of biology and we carry out studies of biology on that basis, then That's opposed to an organic view, which assumes that the organs have a purpose. Then there could be another view, beside from mechanism and organism, which I forget. There was another view that historically was pursued and probably still has some vestigial forms in biology. But the big one around this World War I period was the Bergson vitalism. So vitalism links up more towards Spengler. But these are all, we should remember, this is like specific methods of studying and saying this is what counts as knowledge. So I mean, you think of something like the periodic table, right? You have a way to say this is when we know something about a chemical substance, and it's like by counting the, this number of H2O or something. This is when we know, when we have some knowledge about water. So the guy named Hasek Chang came along not that a decade ago or so and proved very carefully that this schema, that's not really water when you have what they say there. That's not enough because there has to be some other microparticles, some other things going on. You wouldn't really have water if you just had H2O. But that was the schema, right? That's how you know you have knowledge. So likewise, mechanism is one way to do biology. Organism is another way to do biology. It's ways of saying this is what counts as knowing, and this is what our research is pointing towards. And likewise, vitalism was an attempt to do something like that. So taken that way, these fields are always in flux. They always have kind of, this is how we know when we're making order and progress. This is how we predict things. This is what counts as knowledge. And in this horizon, the question of Annal's school comes in, and they say we should look at not at events. War is all about events, sudden events. War itself is an event. Remember Bernard Montgomery had said, history is a war is history, and history is built up on wars. Leo Strauss has said, usually when we say history without any further qualifications, such as art history, what we mean is the history of the wars of states. The next step, according to the now school above history, was supposed to be generational memory and history on the basis of saying this is what my generation thinks, this is how my generation makes decisions. Remember, we just mentioned this notion that every time one makes a decision, one becomes guilty in some way. One takes one path, not another. One comes into conflicts, and because of that, what path does one's generation take, and how is one sort of spontaneously thinking like one's generation? This concept being somewhat unclear. I mean, I think a lot of the problems today are due to the fact that California has a different way of thinking than Texas, and New York has a different way of thinking, and so on. So there's not just one generation, as people like to say, Generation X, Boomers, Generation Y, etc. But there's multiple. You don't know where to draw the compass and find your compass point, because you don't know what's encircling you. So let's rehearse that argument again. Why is Trump a primacist? We haven't made the whole argument yet, but the main reason would be because he's saying we want the Europeans to not be freeloaders. They need to step up. They need to be like this aquiline spirit of America, this eagle, like Trump had prominently, this eagle sitting behind him when he spoke at Davos, right? This is a warlike animal. But we want this red line. So Habermas wrote the article, Red Line Dilemma, and this says it directly. It's like Europeans have this identity of being pacifists, but they have this red line dilemma where they've got to decide whether they want to become militant. And that means stepping up and spending on military. That's what Rudd is saying recently. That's what some others have started to chime in behind Mark Rutte and begun to say the same.